Wings of Nature, the journey into the world of birds, is an opportunity to discover the fascinating world of birds and learn how bird watching can enrich our lives. Beyond being an enjoyable hobby, bird watching helps us to connect with nature, improves our observation skills, and brings a sense of calm and well being. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce Education for All. We are a US based 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free value based education to underprivileged children. Through educational initiatives and webinars like this, we strive to inspire lifelong learning, promote holistic well being, and encourage service to society. Now, my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Ravi Potharlanka. Ravi is a telecom and media executive, entrepreneur, investor, nonprofit board leader, and conservation enthusiast with over 30 years of experience. He has led and built companies including FiberTower and LocusPoint, co-founded in partnership with Blackstone. Ravi holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and also holds master's and bachelor's degree in engineering. With that, it is now my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Ravi Potharlanka. Ravi, thank you for joining us today. We are excited to learn from your knowledge and experience. The virtual series is yours.
Thank you, Shivaram. Thank you all for joining today. This webinar is about birds, birding, and as you'll see, a little bit more than that. This is my first webinar on this subject, and I'm here today due to only one reason: the unrelenting push and pull and drive of my friend Sandeep Raylan, who's one of the leaders at Education for All, along with Shivaram, which is the organization that's hosting and sponsoring this event. Sandeep also happens to be a very close and dear friend of mine, and he is one of the first few friends I made when I showed up in college 41 years back. So I'm very pleased to be doing this and delighted that so many of you chosen to join this webinar. We will cover several things during this webinar. First, I would like to share something about my own personal journey and how I got into birding. But importantly, I'd also like to share what I've learned through the whole process. But I feel like it's important to set the stage before we get into the meat of the presentation. And I promise we'll get to the more meaty part, sooner than later. This is a webinar about birds and birding and also a few other things. The presentation itself will follow, in general, a flow like this. I'd like to set the stage. We're talking about birding. Then we will get into my journey. There will be a brief tour of images. We'll also talk about some things that I've learned along the way, and then end with, how someone can get into birding. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, let me talk about what all this birding is about. Here in the United States, according to the US Fish and Wild Service, there are around 100 million bird watchers. Half of them actually travel more than 50 miles to go engage in this activity. It's quite a large number. The question is, what's going on and why are all these people crazy about this? It might be helpful to sort of break it into a few parts. One is talk about where people go birding. The second thing is how they're doing it. And the third thing is, what are they looking for? So let's talk about where people go birding. A lot of people just have a bird feeder in their backyard, and the birds naturally come to them. And that's pretty simple. Some people go to the local parks. They may even go to nature reserves. And there are a few people who may travel off to far off places to see that one endemic bird, which is a small population. And frankly, after all that, may even never get to see it. So there's a wide variety of places that people go to. In terms of how they do it, many people just watch birds with the naked eyes, but frankly, you end up missing a lot. And having a pair of binoculars makes a huge difference. There are folks who use spotting scopes, which have very high magnifications, where you can tell details apart. There are, of course, folks who end up using their phone cameras, to capture things. And then, of course, you can use your own digital cameras with zoom lenses and tripods. So there's a variety of equipment you can use, so to speak, to engage in this activity. Then the third thing is, what are they looking for? Perhaps the more interesting part of this whole thing. Of course, a lot of people start off by looking at the shape and size of the bird. Then they move into looking at and noticing the colors and patterns, which is what gets most of the people hooked. There are others who start observing behavior. They pay attention to the song or the calls. There are others who get into a little bit more detail and start focusing and noticing the habitat and the range of the birds. Of course, you can get into things like phylogeny, which is basically relationships, as well as evolutionary history of some of the birds that you're observing and noticing. And of course, there are folks who can take it to the next level and start thinking about and focusing and learning about conservation status of each of these birds. So as you can see, there's a very wide variety of where you can do something like this, how you do it, and also what you're looking for. The interesting thing is, irrespective of how people go about doing it, there are a few common things that you hear from most people in terms of the impact it has had on them. One of the things you hear consistently from people is that it's been a really good thing for the mental and emotional health, because it has a very calming effect. It is very meditative. You're in the moment as a result. It has the effect of reducing stress and also anxiety. There are many people who will tell you about the cognitive and learning benefits. One of the things it definitely does is you're exercising parts of the brain that have to do with memory retention and recall and relationships. If you decide to do it with others, there's a social aspect to it. There's definitely a thrill and gaming aspect to it because you just don't know what you're going to be seeing, and there's an excitement of chase. Of course, you had to wake up in the morning and get out of bed and your sofa and go do this outdoors, and there's a physical aspect to it. And if you are inclined creatively, there's an opportunity here for folks to take their experiences and what they're seeing and translate that into writing or drawing or making images through their phones or through cameras. So this is one of those things which is very multimodal. What I mean by that is you don't just get one of these benefits. They all come as a group, and maybe not all of them at any given time, but for the most part, most people will tell you that they experience multiple of these benefits when they engage in an activity like this. Now, there's been a lot written about these things in the press these days, especially after COVID. And I don't believe there have been any detailed studies which basically tie the causal relationships between what people are doing and some of these benefits. But I'll also tell you that this is all true because I've experienced it myself. And I've actually met and talked to many people who have similar experiences. Hence the craze. So what I would like to do now is spend a little bit of time on how I've gone about my own journey, something that I started a little bit late in my career. There are many birders who start very early in their life, and that was certainly not my case. My journey starts in Africa, in Tanzania. This is a place that I've had a long fascination for since my childhood. In the year 2019, my wife, daughter, and I went on an African safari to Tanzania and the famous Serengeti. On the third day of the trip, as we were driving through the savannah, we ended up seeing this bird which was perched on a dead tree stump. As you can see, it's kind of nondescript. It is small. We ended up stopping, and I asked my guide what this bird was, and he mentioned that it is the lilac-breasted roller. And he encouraged me or urged me to pick up my binoculars and actually see it. The moment I saw it, I literally gasped through the binoculars. And I then immediately took out my camera. I had my zoom lens loaded on it. I extended the zoom all the way to 400 mm and took this image. The first thing you realize when you see this image is that it is nothing like the image here. They appear like totally two different things. The next thing you notice is it is a riot of colors. You see this color lilac, which is on its throat and breast, which is a color which is a shade of purple. You see turquoise on the abdomen and the underparts. You also see dark blue. You see green, basically on the crown, and you see some reddish and brown on the back, and you see black on the beak, and you see yellow on the color of its legs. So the thing that's incredible about this is you actually end up missing a lot of this stuff when you actually don't pay attention. And I remember pausing and thinking about the fact that it is incredible that something like this even exists. And then it occurred to me that I'm missing a lot and need to do something about it. It also reminded me of a conversation I had many years before 2019 during one of my first trips to Tanzania, way back in 1996, with a college friend of mine, Charlie. And we were teamed up with a South African couple, which was really into birding. And they were looking at birds throughout the trip, and they were constantly looking at birds with binoculars and gasping and oohs and ahs and exchanging notes about what they'd seen. And so after a day or two, I ended up asking them what this whole birding thing was about. And he talked to me, and then he also said something which, really stuck in my mind. He said after 3 or 4 days of traveling in Africa and looking at all the big mammals, you basically run out of it. And then for the rest of your life, you're looking for birds. It felt like the prophecy is sort of coming true for me after all these years. A bird like this really does something. And in the birding parlance, it's called a spark bird because it's one of those things which basically marks a moment in your life where there's a before and after, and you remember it quite well and changes, many and some things. And so the lilac-breasted roller is my spark bird, which basically got me started on this journey. After the trip, we got back to the US. We were living in Los Angeles, and my wife had introduced me to, the Audubon Society and some of the birding groups there, which she had researched when we were even in Africa. And I started birding. I started going to the local birding spots, the LA River, some of the parks, and started basically spending more and more time. In the process, I also started acquiring a whole bunch of guides and also a couple of books. And one of the books that I acquired during the first few months after I got into this was this book titled Birding Without Borders. This was a book written by a young birder by the name Noah Stryker, which basically documents a year of his life where he went around traveling to 41 countries across 7 continents and ended up seeing 6,042 species in a single year. He did all of this in a $60,000 budget, carrying all his stuff in a 40-liter backpack. So the first thing that occurred to me was it seemed really extraordinary that someone would stop everything in their life and just dedicate, every single hour of a year to doing this. That itself, seemed pretty spectacular. But the second thing is, I was also flabbergasted by the number of species of birds he had seen. Frankly, I did not even know that this many species of birds existed in the world. So I began thinking about perhaps there's some part of this I can do, but first I needed to get educated. So I started researching, how many species are there across the world. As many of you or some of you may remember from your biology and classes or zoology classes, the elemental level of organizing life is the species, and species roll into genus, and genus rolls into families and orders and so on and so forth. Genus is a difficult concept to get your head around, but you can get what a species is, you can understand. And also, as it turns out, in the case of birds, families are quite easy to relate to. As an example, all the penguins belong to a family. All the New World parrots belong to a family. And it's easy to relate to them because they all have similar characteristics. They behave similarly. They also have different, life cycles. So as I started digging into it, what I realized was there were around 11,000 species of birds across the world, and they all grouped into 251 families. So a thought occurred to me that maybe I can do something like what Noah had accomplished, but adjusted for my age and my late life start. And I wonder if I can go about this and accomplish the task of seeing around 1,000 birds in 2 or 3 years. And that's how I got started. The first thing I needed to do was try and understand where these birds existed. As you can imagine, birds and animals don't really care about country boundaries. That's really a human construct, something that we define, we create passports and visas and so on. But birds and animals don't care. All they care about is habitats. But as humans, the way we travel is, based on countries. So it only makes sense that, we end up relating these birds to countries. What you see here is a chart of different countries, but let me take a minute to explain this. On the x-axis, is the total number of species that belong in each country. On the y-axis is the density per square kilometer. And the reason I wanted to sort of understand this is because I wanted to be efficient about the way I went about looking at these birds. As an example, if you take a look at the United States, it has quite a few birds, close to 900 birds, but it has a species density of 1, which is to say, 1 bird per every 10,000 square kilometer. If you take a look at a country like Brazil, it has a lot of birds, twice the number of birds, around 1,813, but also has a higher species density, double the number of United States. As you start learning more about this and the scatter plot, so to speak, you also start seeing there are countries like Costa Rica, which have as many number of birds as the United States, but have a species density of 168. When you think about that, that's pretty incredible. So you have a situation where very similar number of birds is all squished into a very small area, creating this type of species density. So if you were to go looking for lots of birds in a short amount of time, a country like Costa Rica would be a good place to go to. But there's a country called Ecuador, which is kind of a nice compromise. It has a very large number of birds, twice the number of birds of Costa Rica, around 1,600, and has a species density which sits somewhere between the United States and Costa Rica, around 65. So as you can see, as you start looking at the 180 or whatever number of countries around the world, there are some countries which are more birdier than the others. And I quickly began to realize that countries like Ecuador, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania and others are actually quite good if you want to be efficient about the way you go about things. And after realizing this, a couple of months later, I bought a ticket and I was on my way to Ecuador. As I started getting into this, I started realizing that I was also seeing a lot of similar birds. And as I started digging into it, this concept of biogeographic realms sort of came to the forefront. And let me take a second to explain what this is. This is a concept that was uncovered or discovered by Alfred Wallace and other gentlemen, immediately after the Age of Enlightenment in the mid-1800s, which was basically the heyday of natural history, as people were learning and discovering, how the world worked. One of the things that he noticed, Alfred Wallace noticed, was that as he traveled to different parts of the world, there were fundamentally different flora and fauna in each of those countries. The plants and animals looked very different. As an example, you find macaws, in Central and South America. You find kangaroos in Australia. You find hornbills in Asia and, Africa. And so what he concluded was that there was something fundamentally, different about each of these places. And what it was that because each of these land masses had gotten separated, from what was a, mega land mass 250 million years ago, the flora and fauna in each of those land masses evolved independent of each other in apparent isolation. As a result, for millions of years, the plants and animals here in the neotropics evolved independently of those in, Afrotropical area and Australia and so on. And he divided the world into these 7 biogeographic regions, which are Neo-Arctic, which is North America, South America, Africa, basically, and Eurasia, Indo-Malaya, and finally Australia, and of course, Antarctica. And so the thing that's important here out of this is that if you really want to see a variety of families specifically, you really need to start, exploring things in each of these biogeographic regions. Otherwise, you'll end up seeing a lot of the same birds. So in addition to looking at sort of species-rich or density countries, one of the things that I quickly realized was that I really needed to go to, a country or a few countries in each of these regions. As a result, I ended up going to countries here, Ecuador and Brazil and Costa Rica. In the neotropics, of course, United States and, in the Neo-Arctic, Afrotropical area, I managed to, visit Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and of course in Indo-Malayan, realm, Thailand and India, and of course, Australia. As part of this journey now, I've, gone to all these different countries, of course, the United States, and mentioned some of the other countries. And it's been a real fun journey. And over the last 6 to 7 years, I've managed to see around 1,830 species, which all belong to around 175 families. The thing that I'm most excited about this journey, as I started learning more and more about it, is the fact that, if you're focused and also smart about it, you can, not only get to see a lot of species, but also get to see species in different types of families. And so even though I've seen, less than maybe 15% of all the species out there, I managed to get to a lot of families. Of course, it's getting tougher because now I'm left with families that don't have as many species in each of them. And that's clearly making it challenging as I think about kind of the next phase of, the search. One of the neat things about doing something like this now in 2000s is that there's a great tool on the internet called eBird, which is basically a tool that's available from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where you can track everything that you're doing as you look at different birds. You can create checklists, and through a mobile app, which will automatically geotag it, timestamp it, and upload it to the website, and basically track, where all these species are that you've seen. And as you can see on this map, this is a map of all the countries I've been to. And if you double click, it'll tell you kind of how many checklists I've submitted in each of these countries, and also the number of species that I've seen. In addition to that, you can actually go to the next level of detail and start taking a look at each of the provinces or the states in each of those countries. And finally, you get a nice little list of, the latest set of birds that you've seen, basically ordered either by time or location. And as you can see, there are birds here, from my recent trip to Alaska, and there were around 5 or 6 new birds that I saw, in addition to a whole bunch of other birds, which I've seen earlier in other parts of the United States. So this has become a really helpful tool for many people. It certainly has been a huge benefit for me, and it's free. So that kind of brings me to the end of, how I got started and what's happened in the last, 5 to 6 years in my own journey. What I would like to do now is share with you a video of a number of images that I made during these journeys. And it is a fairly curated list of images, and I will actually do a narration as we're going through this. I will also tell you that it is very clean, and it does not include all the messiness that's associated with, getting to, a video like that. And one of the reasons is because I'm not going to talk to you and tell you about the time I was rained in because of a typhoon in Thailand. I was sitting in a cottage for 3 days, or the time that I was basically wet to my bone when there was a huge downpour in Australia, or when I got bitten by a whole bunch of mosquitoes in Ecuador, or the time when I was sitting in the Amazon sweating, waiting for parrots to show up at a clay lake for 6 hours, and they never did show up. So I will not share with you those stories, but I will show you a nice curated list. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. And now I'm going to switch to this video here in a second. This is a 3-minute video, and I will be narrating as this video rolls. Here it goes. If you ever do what I did, you might find yourself one day deep in the Pantanal in Brazil, staring at a bird like this, the Hyacinthaca, or in the Himalayan foothills where you might see the Kalich pheasant. If you fancy the mountains, you may end up in the Andes full of hummingbirds, and you might see the sparkling violet ear, or maybe the magnificent green-crowned brilliant. If you end up in the cloud forests of the Andes, you might end up seeing the crimson rump toucanet coming to the feeders. As you travel, you will witness spectacular landscapes like this one in Western Australia, or a sunset in the plains of Africa, or maybe a sunrise in the Serengeti. Some days, on your way to seeing birds, a waterfall might stop you in your tracks, and you'll slow the shutter speed down and make an image like this. You might see a flock of African skimmers take off by a lake in Uganda, or a flock of flamingos taking off on a lake in Kenya, or a bunch of pelicans roosting on a small island. Or in California, you might witness the takeoff and landing of thousands of wintering geese in the Central Valley. As you keep looking for birds, you might run into someone like this, a gorilla in the mist. You might come across also a pool full of hippos staring at you. One day, you might come across a thinking chimpanzee. And then, a lion and lioness calling it a day. Sometimes you'll get to do things with your favorite people. You may even get to make chocolate from pods in Costa Rica with your family. You will meet very knowledgeable guides and some philosopher guides. And if you're lucky, you may even end up dragging one of your childhood friends on this crazy adventure. And if you're willing to be patient, you may end up making an image like this, because this toucan, will come to the same spot, same time every day. You may even catch a woodpecker in flight. Or a mother feeding a child. You might even catch this dazzling Jacobin hummingbird just about to take flight. So these are some of the things you will see when you go birding. Thank you. So that concludes the presentation of the video. What I'd like to now do is talk about things that I've learned along the way, which I think will be interesting to a lot of folks, which is less about me and more about birds. The presentation I put here together captures a story or history of 4 different birds. And the birds are shown here, and I will talk about each of those, and hopefully there's something that you'll take away from each of these. One is the shoebill, the second one is the Blackburnian warbler, the third one is the velvet purple coronet, and the last one is the gray crowned crane. So let's talk about each of these birds. The bird that you see here on screen is called the shoebill. This is an image I took in Uganda, and it's a bird that's out in the swamps and takes a long time to get there. You go through this burn-crushing road on a Jeep, and then you get into a little canoe with a motor and ultimately go searching for it. And if you're lucky, you find it. One of the things you notice about this bird is it is really strange looking. It's not the typical cute bird or a colorful bird, that we end up seeing, on a day-to-day basis. It has a hook at the edge of his bill. It has a yellow eye. It has obviously a very gray coat to its whole body. It's around 5 feet tall, and when it spreads its wings and is flying, it's around 8 feet. So it's a massive bird, and it eats these things called lungfish. It is nothing like what we think about as a nice little bird. And here's another image of it, which I also took. Again, the stare itself is really otherworldly. As it turns out, there are actually several birds which have characteristics which don't make them look like birds. On the top left, you find a bird called the secretary bird. This is a bird which is endemic to Africa. It has powerful legs. It has with these long legs, it basically hunts on the ground, stops in the prey, and almost has a predatory dinosaurs type of, behavior. Here in the United States, we have the wild turkey. Again, when you actually pay attention to the details and look at its bare head, it's red, it is scaly, it has strong legs, again, has a very otherworldly appearance. And finally, the roadrunner, which is a small bird, but it's built for speed, and it almost looks like a small version of the famous T-Rex. So it has been long suspected that there was some sort of a relationship with birds and dinosaurs, which obviously became very famous, in the early, around 90s. The first evidence for this actually came in around 1860s, and there's an interesting story associated with this. In Germany, they found a fossil in 1861, which was basically one that had bird features and dinosaur features. So it had features which had to do with feathers and wings, but also had dinosaur features which had to do with teeth and clawed fingers. As some of you may know, birds don't have teeth. And so this was very interesting. And so this was one of the first pieces of evidence that there was actually a transitional form which basically related dinosaurs and birds. This was also 2 years after Darwin's famous On the Origin of Species was published, in a time when people started thinking about these things. As it turns out, over the next several years, and actually even recently, people have continued to find fossils of this transitional form, and it's been named the Archaeopteryx, which has basically both features of a bird and dinosaur. Scientists have, since and over long periods of time, constructed it to really project out what it might have looked like, and what they've concluded is based on, the pattern of the bones and the wings and the feathers, that this probably is a bird which is a little bit larger than a chicken. It could glide well, but it really couldn't fly in the traditional sense, but it could perform short bursts of flight. But certainly, this was fairly conclusive that there was some sort of relationship. So as people have researched over time, they really pieced the story together quite well. And I want to share a couple of things in that regard. As many of you might know, there was a large asteroid that hit the Earth, 66 million years ago, and it actually landed in the Gulf of Mexico as we know it today. And that basically caused a massive extinction on the Earth. 75% of all the species died, but it also led to the extinction of all the dinosaurs. Well, not quite all, and I'll tell you about that in a second. Now, how do we know this? We know this because as you start looking at fossils, and as you keep going deeper, below 66 million years, you find fossils of dinosaurs, but after that, you don't. And so after that, there were no more dinosaurs on the Earth. But what did happen was that there was a small group of dinosaurs, one lineage of dinosaurs that did actually survive this extinction event. Amongst the dinosaurs, there was a group called the theropod dinosaurs. And the theropod dinosaurs were bipedal, which means they could walk on their two hind feet. And within that, there was another lineage called maniraptors, which basically, in addition to being able to walk on their 2 feet, also had the 4 arms with which they can manipulate. Over time, through evolution, a small branch of those, evolved to become what are para-avs. As it turns out, this particular lineage of theropod dinosaurs was small in size, they had feathers, they're warm-blooded, and they could eat a variety of food, including seeds. And because of the size and the fact that they could digest different types of foods, they survived this big extinction event. And ultimately, these are the ones that evolved and created the large number of bird species that we see on the planet today. So when somebody tells you that dinosaurs went extinct, well, you can have a nice retort and tell them that they don't, because there are 11,000 of them around on the planet today. The next thing I'd like to tell you about is this bird called the Blackburnian warbler. This is a bird that I saw in Ecuador many years back. I was with my guide as we were walking around, and this is a very small bird, actually. And he pointed it out to me, and he said, "This is one of your birds." And I was really puzzled, and I didn't quite understand what he meant. But before I get to that, let me also describe this bird to you. First thing, it's quite difficult to spot. It usually is on the top of the forest canopy. It is the size of an average strawberry. So if it's really high up there and you're trying to look for a strawberry, as you can imagine, it's quite difficult. Binoculars definitely help, but it has a very vivid orange plumage. And so that is kind of a giveaway, and you can actually spot it because of how bright and distinct it is, compared to everything else that may be on a tree. But the thing that's interesting about this bird is this bird was visiting Ecuador. And when the guide actually told me that, this is one of our birds, as I researched it, what I realized was this is actually a bird that breeds and lives a good part of their life in North America. And I want to tell you about kind of what happens, because there's a larger this backstory is a larger story about what happens with large numbers of birds all over the world. This particular bird, turns out, actually breeds up in parts of North America and also Canada. During the months of June, July, and August, it breeds, makes babies, lays eggs, and so on and so forth. And as the weather starts turning cold, these birds start migrating, sometimes 50 miles a day, sometimes 100 miles a day, and they keep making their, way down from up here all the way to the edges of the Gulf of Mexico near Texas and Louisiana. And they fatten up here and then make sure that they have enough energy for them to make this big jump of 400 to 500 where there's no land. So they can't really stop over. And they basically make this journey of 500 miles, and nonstop, and ultimately make their way through all the way Central America and end up in the basically mountain forests of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and spend all their winter months there, where up north it's really cold. And this is where I saw this bird for the first time because it traveled all the way down. And there's many, many birds that do this, but this is one particular bird. And after they spend the winter months down here in South America, they make their way back again to the months of April and May, and then ultimately get back to the breeding grounds. So it's actually a spectacular journey when you think about this. This is a small little bird the size of a strawberry that's actually doing this, over a period of 5 to 6,000, miles over 1 year. And there are many things that are important about this, but one of the more important things to understand is birds don't live in one place. When we think about humans or maybe even land animals, there's a certain area that they're restricted to, but a bird can fly. And as a result, it depends on the habitats and what's going on all over the place, not only where it's breeding, not only where it's wintering, but also where it's basically stopping, which are the fueling stops. And so as you think about birds and what they need to live, it's just more than, where you see them. And oftentimes, they depend on habitats and food from different parts of the world. The thing that's interesting is this particular bird is not unique. There are actually many birds that migrate and do something similar. What you see here is patterns of migration in the fall only. It doesn't show the reverse migration of many birds that basically breed in the boreal forests of Canada and also in Alaska. And after they're done breeding, they basically migrate down in the fall. And here in the Americas, there are humans who sort of try to categorize these into three flyways. There's the Western Flyway, where a whole bunch of birds, fly across the western part of the United States and down to these parts of South America. There's the Central Flyway, where birds fly through, the central United States. And then there's basically the Eastern Flyway along the East Coast. And then some of these birds go all the way down to Argentina. Now, what I'll also tell you is many of the birds try to stick to the landmass here and travel all through Central America because that gives them fueling stops. They can stop, they can eat, they can wait for 2 or 3 days and keep continuing. But there are birds that will actually make big jumps. They will fly all the way to an edge and then fly for 400, 500 miles. In fact, there are a few birds that will do this big journey all the way from the East Coast of the United States and fly for 2,000 miles, across the Atlantic. So there's a wide variety of ways the birds do it. Now, this is just not an America's phenomenon. This happens all over the world. There are migratory flyways, here in the Americas. There are migratory flyways here in Asia, as well as between Europe and Africa. The reason this is kind of important is I started this whole topic, focused on the blackbird and warbler. But the fact is, something like this is happening at any given time, many, many places all over the world. And it has important conservation and habitat implications because in addition to thinking about where the bird is breeding or maybe wintering, all the fueling stops are also quite important. So at any given time, you can imagine there are millions and millions of birds doing this all over the world. It's a really fascinating phenomenon that doesn't quite meet the eye. There are tools these days to actually track these and monitor this that are published by various groups, including Cornell. The third bird I want to talk about is a bird that's one of my favorite birds. It's called the violet purple cornet. And this is a hummingbird. And this is a bird which is found mostly, not mostly, but almost exclusively in the mountain forests of Colombia and Ecuador. And when you look at the bird initially, it looks pretty drab. And in fact, when there's no light on it, it kind of looks, black and grayish and really nothing spectacular to think about. But when light shimmers on this hummingbird, you begin to see, these incredible colors. They're all shining. One is you begin to see the violet, the purple, you see the turquoise, you see some of the green, and you also see the chestnut wings when they basically flash their wings open. And in fact, it also has a white patch here by the tails, the edge. This is definitely one of those birds that takes your breath away when you actually see it in light. And also when it's landing, it flashes its wings up. And hummingbirds in themselves are extremely, beautiful and have all the shimmering colors. And once you see a bird like this, you basically get to a point where you're done seeing. this is it. So it's quite an incredible bird. Um, but there's something more here than just the beauties of this color. Hummingbirds are incredible birds. They, at least right now, exist only in the Americas. Most of them are actually in Central and South America. Some of them here and then in the United States. But they're birds that have some features that really not many birds have. One is they beat their wings at a really high speed. So that's 50 to 80 times per second. When you think about that, you're talking about a bird that's basically, going at really high speeds. It can hover, it can fly backward, forward. It's one of the only birds that actually can do that. It has a very high metabolism. It's a heart that beats at 1,200 times per minute. To put that in perspective, the human heart, beats at around, maybe 60, 70, 80. And if we're exercising, maybe it gets to 120 or 130. So we're talking about a bird that's basically, 10, 12, 15 times, what a human heart beats at. And as a result, it has to constantly eat, and it eats as much as its body weight and multiple body weight of the body is my understanding. The other thing that's also interesting about these birds is that a lot of the colors that you see on the hummingbirds are not due to the pigments on the feathers, but actually come from the fact that there are these little structures, on their body, which basically reflect light. And so as a result, the light reflection is what creates all this, shimmering hues. And one of the things I would encourage you to do is if you look at hummingbird from one vantage point and then move yourself, it'll actually look different because of the way the light reflects off. And so that's one of the cool features about these birds where, the colors don't emerge out of the pigmentation, but from the reflections, of these microscopic structures. And finally, the other cool thing about hummingbirds is that they have excellent memory. They basically do this thing called trapping, and they're able to figure out, which birds have how much of nectar. And when you notice this, they will actually repeat the same thing over and over again. They'll go from place to place, go land for a second, and then come back and do the same thing. So these are some of my favorite birds, and have some incredible things which, we don't think about on a day-to-day basis. The last bird I want to talk about is the gray-crowned crane. The gray-crowned crane is endemic to Africa and actually exists in large parts of the continent. And I'll show you a map of that in a second. This is an image of the crane. This is not an image that I took, but I got off the internet. And I want to just talk about this for a second before we get a little bit deeper. This is a bird that has a white patch on its neck. It has a crown, which is kind of golden color. It looks like a pom-pom. It obviously has, shades of gray, on its feathers. And finally, it has this thing called a gular pouch, which basically inflates when it's making sounds and honking. Now, here's an image I took. This is an image that I took in Kenya. And I was very fortunate to do this because you don't really get an opportunity to see all of them at the same time in a big group without them all, blocking each other. Now, this is an interesting bird. I mean, the gray-crowned crane basically is one of those birds where the male and female pair bond for their life, and they're together. They have elaborate, dancing displays, and I tried to capture some of them when they were doing that. They also have, voices which are pretty honking. And the thing that's unfortunate about these birds is that they're actually in a lot of danger. And here's a study that was published by the International Crane Foundation, or a group of that. And what you see here is, basically the range of this particular crane, which exists in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, parts of Tanzania, but also they exist here in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. In 1985, it was estimated that there were 100,000 cranes in Africa, this particular crane in Africa. 30 years later, that number was down to around 30,000. So in a matter of around 30 years, the population of gray-crowned cranes basically went down by 70%, which is really spectacular when you think about this. And this is a bird based on a fossil record we believe has existed on the planet from 34 to 56 million years ago. So let's call it 45 million years. So it's been around for a very long time, certainly longer than humans. And when you start digging into it, one of the things you realize is the reason this is happening is because of habitat loss. They depend on wetlands, and wetlands have been drained, by humans. There's been agricultural expansion, and of course, because of the beauty of these birds, there's been a lot of illegal capture. So over time, what people have figured out is they're not only in danger, but perhaps even at the risk of extinction. And it is believed that, just given the small numbers and the fact that they have smaller living areas, that there's actually a chance that some of these birds this particular species could go extinct in 20, 25 years or in 4 to 5 generations. So it is actually a very shocking thing when you realize something like this, that a bird that's been around for millions of years could actually go extinct. And a large part of it has to do with us humans. So when you actually start digging into this, you realize that gray-crowned crane is not unique. This is actually happening to a lot of birds. What you see here is unfortunately kind of a dense chart, but it talks about, how different birds are positioned right now relative to some of the dangers that they're facing. And this is published by IUC and the International Union of Conservation for Nature. And I'll kind of walk through this here briefly. On the left side is basically a grouping of birds that are okay. They don't have any problems. And there's around, according to IUCN, around 6,000 birds that are thriving and are doing well. There's around 2,000 birds that are getting into danger. On the extreme right are birds that have gone extinct. But the really unfortunate and maybe sobering thing about this chart is the middle bucket here. It is believed that around 3,000 birds out of the 11,000 birds or so are actually threatened and are at the risk of extinction, over whatever number of years. So that's actually a staggering number when you think about this. So 25 to 26% of all birds are threatened today. And when you start thinking about this further, you start wondering about why this is happening. And one of the primary reasons this is happening to birds like gray-crowned crane and some of the other birds is they're losing habitat, or their habitat is getting degraded. And why is that happening? Well, it's happening because of two reasons. One is agricultural expansion, and then the next thing is urbanization, and a lot of it is being driven by people needing more space. The other thing that's also happening is there are specific things that are being done by humans, or that humans are doing, which actually have an immediate impact on the survivability of some of these birds. One is the existence of a lot of glass these days, in buildings. Birds cannot see through glass. They only see reflections, and they'll end up hitting them as a result. And especially after the Second World War, there's been a huge influx of glass in buildings. The second thing is free-roaming cats, which are one of the leading causes of, bird-related death, especially small birds. And these are cats that prey on birds. And it's a huge challenge, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. The third thing is building and tower lights. And a lot of these lights, which at nighttime end up basically disorienting the birds, which would lead them to basically crashing into them, or maybe just flying off course. And especially during the migration time, this becomes a huge problem. And of course, there's vehicle strikes. The last thing that's also happening, as you can imagine, is the environmental issues. There's climate change, which is disrupting their habitats and where they get food from. The second thing is the use of pesticides by us, in farms and agriculture. DDT is no longer used, but there's a new family of drugs called, a new family of pesticides called neonics. And neonics are synthetic pesticides. And as it turns out, they can be neurotoxic, for birds. And these pesticides are being used to basically manage the insect population in farms. But birds rely on those insects. And as a result, they end up eating contaminated food. And there are times when a bird will get directly impacted, or this makes it through the food chain, and ultimately they get impacted. And the sad thing is, there are times when a bird might die as a result of this, but it could also be damaged neurologically and continues to live, due to this impact. And of course, this invasive species, which is basically, other animals and plants that are introduced to areas that they don't belong in, which basically take over. As an example, there's so many examples of, things that were introduced in Hawaii that basically ultimately led to the killing off and extinction of, a certain number of birds in Hawaii. So it's a very sobering thing when you think about this. And when you start looking into it further, you realize that this is not specific to just birds. This is actually happening, in, basically other kingdoms, animal kingdoms too. So it's happening with mammals or other classes. It's happening with mammals, where again, it's estimated that around 25 to 26% of all mammals are threatened. And it's happening to reptiles. So that really begins to make you think, and you want to pause and wonder about, what is going on. I started this whole presentation and webinar talking about my smart bird. And now I find myself at a different place. I really wonder if it must be this way. If we humans should continue to commandeer the resources of the planet, so much so that we're now driving other life forms to extinction. I have personally started, trying to learn more and think about the environment, ecosystems, habitats, conservation, and climate change, and so on. And I'm trying to figure out if there are things that I can do in my own small way to actually turn the tide. And I'm still at the start of the process, and I'm hopeful that I can spend time on doing this. The birds got me here. And to be clear, I get still very excited when I go birding, when I go on that one particular trip, when I'm taking images, making images, taking pictures, and so on. But it's also changed me. You see, things like climate change and conservation, habitat restoration, they all tend to be abstractions, really, until you get close to some part of nature. And then it gets real. And that's what birds did to me. And it's a good place to be, and I'm glad I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for that wonderful and insightful presentation. Your passion for birds and your deep appreciation for nature have truly inspired us to look at the world around us with the greater curiosity and awareness, especially your similarities between how the bird originated from dinosaurs. That is an eye-opener. Now, with that, we'll now move into our next session. We'll start off with our panelists and then move on to the last part of it. Now, Sandeep, over to you if you have any questions.
Yeah, Ravi, this is, wow. First of all, this is mind-blowing, the amount of knowledge, information, and your passion, to conserve the birds and the species. So I was just wondering, we should spread the education. So we also have schools around in India which education for all supports. So I believe you visited Kondapaka school near Hyderabad. What was your thought? Did you try to educate them on these issues? Could you share your experience there? That would be great for everybody to know, like how you're also pursuing your passion to spread awareness. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep, and thanks for the question. So I did have a chance, thanks to my association now with EFA, to go visit one of your schools close to Hyderabad. It's in the Kondapaka campus. This is a campus. First thing, it's beautiful, and it's very nicely, maintained and done. They're very passionate and very committed, staff there. There are hundreds of students. I had the opportunity to spend, what was almost a day with around 100 students, ninth graders, and I also believe 10th graders. The thing that I will say about my visit there was the presentation and the workshop that I did was different from this, because I actually was talking to them and it was very interactive and we went back and forth. But the team there was very supportive, but also students were engaged, they were interactive, and importantly, they were curious. I was also very touched to hear some of their stories about their backgrounds and where they come from. some of them orphaned, some of them coming from, really underprivileged backgrounds, but yet, they were able to communicate quite well thanks to the education that, the institution is providing. And they were really curious about all. And maybe the thing that I was really heartened by is it resonated. They got it. They understood the fact that we're part of nature, and it's one whole world. And it was really fun to have that experience with them. And we ended up doing a quiz, and I wanted to see if the workshop actually was impactful. As it turns out, most of them actually did quite well at the quiz, and the overall visit was quite a delight for me. Thank you. Yeah.
Wow. No, I see that from the pictures what Shivram is showing. Yeah, their excitement and their things. Thank you so much, Ravi. Shivram, over to you if you have anything to add about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, as Sandeep, and as you mentioned, whatever Ravi is presenting, it's a very good educational thing, probably in all of our campuses. And so hope Ravi will spend more time with our other campuses also. And we have very good feedback from the Kondapaka campus, where all the children loved Ravi's presentation.
Thank you. Yeah. I believe we have just one more section about how someone can explore or get into birding, and I'm happy to do that now.
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, excellent. So one of the things I hear from people is how they can explore this, maybe if it's not even a hobby, and try it. And I put some materials together that might help people kind of get started. And this will be brief and quick. So one thing I would recommend is getting a pair of binoculars. It is amazing what a difference it can make, and it can actually really get you hooked. And as you'll see here, these are images of the same bird, taken at different magnifications. This is done at 8x, this is 10x, and you're going all the way to 18x. You see similar thing here for another bird, going from 8x to 12x and 14x. A good compromise is getting a binoculars, which has a magnification around 8 to 10x, because as you start going up, you really have to hold the binoculars very stable, and that becomes a challenge. So for someone who's starting off, getting a binoculars with 8 or 10x magnification, does a really good job, and you can get an entry-level binoculars, for a couple of $100 and get going. And I always tell people that, whether you're into birding or not, get a pair of binoculars. It'll expose a whole new world that you didn't know existed, even in your backyard. The second thing you could do is go get a few field guides. These are readily accessible. The ones that I go to all the time here in the United States are the National Geographic field guide, which is really great. The Sibley's, which is more picture oriented. Likewise with Peterson. Peterson was one of the first field guides that ever came out actually in the United States and in the world. The other thing about these field guides is they're actually beautiful books. I mean, in my own house, I maybe have like 25 or 30 of these field guides from different parts of the world. I will buy multiple field guides for the same area because they're all done differently, and they're beautiful, beautiful drawings and images. The next thing is one could go get an app, which is published by Cornell and maintained by them. It's called Merlin. And it helps you identify the birds that you're looking at. And you can go through a step-by-step process where it'll ask you a few questions, 4 or 5 simple questions. And if you see a bird and you tell it what the location you're at, it'll help you narrow it down. You can actually capture the sounds that you're hearing, and it'll track things down for you and identify the birds, also based on your location. And of course, you can take a photo and upload it, and it'll help you zoom in. And as you'll see, when I took this image, there were 60,000 people in the world who were basically using the Merlin app at that particular time and listening to the sounds so that they can identify the birds. It's a very easy way to get started. You can actually go on you can get this app, turn it on, and go for a walk, and it'll give you a list of all the birds you heard, so to speak. In addition to that, you can actually explore in your particular location what are the likely birds in that area. And in addition to that, you can actually track all the birds you've seen and create your own life list if that's something that you're interested in. In addition to the Merlin app, there's another app called the eBird, and eBird serves a different purpose, and it helps you basically track all your observations. It will not only show you hotspots, but also you can basically, start a birding trip or go on a walk and start a checklist and start checking things off. And it will, as I mentioned earlier, it will geotag it or timestamp things, especially birds you're seeing, and then ultimately create lists for you, which you can roll up and maintain. And again, this is if you're really into listing and tracking birds and so on and so forth. But the thing that's nice about it is once it's geotagged and timestamped, it's there forever, and it'll create lists for county, it'll show you a list for state, for country, and so on and so forth, and everything is happening in the background. And of course, there's also a website called ebird.org, and this may be a site you want to go to take a look at, different spots. And this is basically a map of the San Francisco Bay Area. And as you can see, there are many, many, many places that people go birding, and each one of these little signs is a place where someone has gone birding. And there are some places which are red and orange and yellow where there are many, many species. And this is one of my favorite spots to go to, and the Hayward shoreline. And where I live is very close to this area. And if you double click into this, it will tell you about not only all the birds that were ever seen, but also birds that were seen in the last 2 or 3 days. And this is one of the things you could do to get yourself familiarized before you go there if you really want to get into it. So at least these days, things have become quite easy to get going because of some of these tools. And it's no longer the case that you need to do a lot of research on the internet. You can download a couple of these apps or maybe get one of these field guides and really get going. So I think of this as one of those activities that has very low activation energy and has huge, payoffs. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for sharing your knowledge, experience, and passion for the incredible world of birds. Your presentation has reminded us to slow down, observe, and appreciate the beauty of nature around us. We truly appreciate the time and effort you have taken to inspire all of us today. I would also like to sincerely thank our wonderful panelists for joining us and contributing their valuable thoughts and perspective during today's session. Your participation has added depth and richness to our conversation. A special thank you to all our attendees for being part of this webinar. Your presence and interest encourage us to continue bringing meaningful learning experiences and inspiring conversations to our community. Today's session was not just about birds, it was also about developing a deeper connection with the nature and understanding the importance of protecting the world we share. Before we conclude, we once again invite you to stay connected with Education for All and support our mission of providing free, value-based education to children in need. Together, we can help create opportunities for children to learn, grow, and build a brighter future. For more information about us and to participate, please visit our website, educationforall.org. That is educationforall.org. Thank you once again, Ravi, our panelists, and everyone who joined us today. With that, we conclude today's webinar, Wings of Nature, the Joy and Science of Birdwatching. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
When I was in 8th, a sudden that my father passed away due to sudden stroke. My mother was a daily wage worker, became the sole breadwinner of the family. Since my mother used to go to work every day in the morning, she was not able to prepare food. We had to go to school on empty stomach. But here, life took a different turn. Since I joined in Prashanti Balamandira school, every day I used to get hot breakfast and they started taking care all of my expenses and requirements.
ರೊಕ್ಕ ಕೊಡೋದು ಕಷ್ಟ ಆದರೂ ಎಲ್ಲೋ ನಮ್ಮ ಸೋರು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕೊಟ್ಕೆಲ್ಲ ರೊಕ್ಕ ಕೊಟ್ಕೆ ಕಲಿಸ್.
I lost my mother when I was 5 years old. For few years, my relatives took care of me. In 6th, I joined Jaipura. I learned many things like teaching of Apara and Paravidya. The best gift which I have received is the gift of education, which in my village, many children did not get it. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your support. Your support is helping me to realize my dream.
I could see how education was being offered as a noble service to society. This inspired me to come back and serve in the school where I received my education.